I am the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at Morven Museum, and I welcome you all to our afternoon with Dr. Ezra Shales. We were lucky enough to get him to fly down here today from Boston, so we're really thrilled that he's with us. And the biggest thrill, I guess, is, in case you don't know, this book was instrumental in the gallery show that we have right now in Newark, the Newark and the Culture of Art. So he's the author of this, and we actually have some copies if you'd like to purchase. So today we're going to get more of the inspiration behind our exhibition. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Ezra Shales.
Thanks for having me. It is a great exhibition, I think, on many fronts, especially the way it synthesizes the decorative arts of the Strouds with the rest of the cohort of paintings. My talk today is really about something. I think it's an intermediate form that we've lost touch with, the bookplate, because it's not quite visual art, it's not quite graphic art, because it's really dependent. You paste it onto something else. You don't usually enjoy it on its own merits. I have a little bit of a silly title there about apps in terms of appetizers, but also I think in terms of the way we use apps to navigate social groups, and the way we use apps to kind of solve social problems. And I think the bookplate was very much part of this in terms of ways to explain how the library would function for different constituencies. So I brought these down. You can just take one and pass them out. Those are little takeaways, gifts, which is this front and back has a bunch of the images of the bookplate, so you can actually take this back and mull on it. Some of them are rather humorous, I believe. I'm going to walk to the back and speak to the images from back here. So my book, Made in Newark, very much focuses on industrial arts, which is another way we can think of the bookplate. What is the bookplate? It's not quite craft, it's not quite design, it's not quite fine art. It is under the rubric of industrial arts, which back at the turn of the century, a whole host of activities fell under these rubrics that were less segmented and siloed off than craft and design are today. We don't usually think of industrial design and say a kind of a domestic handicraft speaking to each other, but here in this image, which is actually a stained glass window in the Newark Museum, dedicated to actually the head of the industrial arts programs in the Newark Public Schools, a man named Hugo Froelich. We can see sewing kind of celebrated here as a kind of a skill to learn, as an inventive act of genius, as labor, as entrepreneurial. So as many things, and so this image for me, and I'll show you the larger window I think later on, gets you to understand what I meant by industrial arts. In many ways, I'm going to talk today about workmanship and industrial arts, and there's no better way to sum that up than to show you the founder of the Newark Museum Association. The Newark Public Library is established earlier in the 19th century. John Cotton Dana comes there to be the head of the Newark Free Public Library just after the turn of the century. The Newark Museum does not exist formally as a building yet, or as an association even. Dana creates the Newark Museum Association after being there for 10 years. But exhibitions happen earlier on, and demonstrations of production happen. So what you see there on the left is, I believe to be, and this is my conjecture in my book, Marguerite Gates, who trained to be the library and museum printer, and John Cotton Dana, who grew up in his family's general store up in Woodstock, Vermont, learning skills, learning habits, actually printing his own newspaper as a child, The Acorn. And he used to annoy his wife by staying late printing as a kind of hobby. at the institution. And there he is holding up a poster he's proud of, obviously, and posing for a photographer. The press isn't that old at the time. The typeface is extremely new, and I write about that in my book. It's called Cheltenham, and it's just been designed by Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, a Boston Harvard Arts and Crafts fellow in 1896. And Dana likes Cheltenham, this typeface, and he's using it. He buys that, a new type, for his press. But they're rather spare and austere posters that he makes. At that time, I don't know if you know about the history of printing, a lot of my students have a hard time differentiating, let's say, engraving from a drawing, from an aquatint, from a lithograph. Dana's training for his librarians included all that knowledge, because he believed we needed to have a kind of a visual acuity to differentiate these things, and that these processes were incredibly important in terms of culture and understanding culture. On the right is the bookplate advertising my lecture, and I love that bookplate because it's rare in our culture that we today take an image of belching smokestacks and see them as almost beautiful, and here that's being synthesized with this Art Nouveau organic ornament. So the idea of growth in the smokestacks and in the vegetal growth is somehow is of a piece and not being kind of diametrically opposed the way we sometimes think of it today. That bookplate for me really synthesizes or exemplifies how John Cotton Dana really believed his library should be a, quote, engine of culture. And it's not really very often today where we think of libraries as places where things are made. Usually we think of libraries and museums as places where things are stored, or warehouses almost, of goods from the past. But Dana really believed that, quote, the museum of the future will permit its visitors to see the objects in the process of being made, right? And this is no better example because he had the printing press not stored away in the back of the library, but visible in an alcove. And the library printer and then the museum printer would be working on and making things that the public could see. Newark was a very exciting city, as your exhibition demonstrates. There were lots of industrial expositions going on then. On the right, you see a book that Dana co-authored with a Newark woman, and they're subtitled by Frances Doyne Tomley, An Idle Woman and John Cotton Dana, A Busy Man. And the book is The Romance of Labor, very much celebrating in a kind of arts and crafts ethos the joy of good work. And there's a wonderful chair in our exhibition here, in your exhibition, by Loeffler, which says, basically, if you're going to do something, do it well. And that's carved in the back of the chair. I just took a picture of it, so I don't have the quote exactly right, but that is a kind of a statement you can find in the work of Letheby, the English arts and crafts architect, who said the art, work is who celebrated the art of doing work well. Let's just leave it at that. And move on to 1911, where John Cotton Dana establishes a magazine called The Newarker. And this might seem a minor thing for a cultural institution to have a publication today, because most of our cultural institutions advertise, and we're used to hearing advertisements for museums and on NPR or watching them even on television. Here, The Newarker, and the name doesn't come off the tongue that easily, I think, is actually the cover of it is actually cut by John Cotton Dana there, and he's signing it, JCD. And he's celebrating Newark in a way by making it the focal point of the map and showing how all roads lead to Newark for transit of goods. And I love to compare this to Saul Steinberg's view from 9th Avenue, sometimes referred to as a parochial New Yorker's view of the world, where everything else is just a little blip, and New Jersey is this little sliver. In some ways, I think John Cotton Dana is purposefully making New York this little thing on the right-hand side. And the reason why I want to emphasize the importance of this advertising and promoting the city, but also promoting the cultural institutions, is that at the time it was absolute blasphemy for Dana to actually hang his posters up on the on the entrance to the museum. And so here you're seeing a letter to the editor in the Newark News from a disgusted Newarker who thinks that the advertising cheapens the whole institution, right? And with Dana, there's this real strong commitment and belief that culture can't be beautiful if it's not useful, right? So the idea of use and the underscoring of use is important in terms of understanding Dana. He advertised on the city streets, a little bit bold here. Who knows? Your library knows. Ask it, and then signing it, JCD, librarian. He also composed exhibitions of printed matter. And these exhibitions, I think, are really important because we don't think of the library as a place where things are exhibited or where we learn visual education. And this is a wonderful way in which you can understand how the museum evolves out of the library. On the left is an exhibition that's a portable knockdown exhibition of those placards, just a bit smaller than that size actually that it's being projected at. And that is in the possession of the New York Public Library. About 25 sets still exist of this exhibition. That is an exhibition about printing. Here you can see how it's kind of faded, it's chipped at the corners. But what's really interesting is that the Newark Public Library sold these to other institutions, and so we have a sense of its breadth of how many places it traveled to. And Dana was a kind of real empiricist and quantified this too. So we actually have numbers of all libraries still do this today. They tell you how many people came to them or through the doors, how many people took out a book, and so they recorded how many visitors came to each exhibition and how many places their exhibitions traveled to. And I would say also, just to back up a minute, it is phenomenal in terms of the attendance, right? The attendance back then at the Newark Public Library exhibitions rivaled the Metropolitan Museum of Art at times. And that's really a notion of making the museum accessible to the public. But it's also Dana way ahead of the curve in terms of saying, let's get every Newark school child into our doors, which most museums were not doing. He was already doing that in the library. The children's room is something you might be used to in terms of a function or a separate room that most libraries have today. It was a novel idea. Dana was a huge champion of this idea in the American Library Association. And on the right, you can see how there is a poster that the Museum Association is making saying, kids, you can make your own exhibitions inside the museum, right? Which is kind of, and then if you go into the details, you'll see they're talking about what should we exhibit, marbles and things like that. And the implication is that everything that kids collect is worth exhibiting. Bottle caps, cards, you name it. Another way to think of Dana as progressive is to see how he advertised Winsor McKay's work. Winsor, it's pronounced by some Mackay, some McKay. His Little Nemo in Slumberland is one of the new kind of Sunday comics which are coming out. And there again, there's some controversy that you have to situate this in. There is a kind of movement that sees comics as loosening up the morals of young children and things like that. And Sunday comics as not necessarily a good thing. And Dana sticks this in the museum and in his exhibition as a demonstration of block printing. So there's not an aesthetic judgment of this, it's just a specimen of what's going on around. And your museum might really like this. Here, there's an exhibition of weeds at the library, right? And he's saying here, the art is not necessarily in the beauty or the rareness or the awesomeness of the flower, but it's just in observing nature around you and observing these wildflowers and weeds that are all growing up in the local gardens and byways. Right? Oh, that's a little out of order, sorry. So they're talking about different names for marbles. Nothing, no, there's no sinuendo or sexual innuendo going on. I got a whole lot of climaxes. Beauty has no relation to price, rarity, or age. This is one of those big slogans. You could say this is incredibly important in terms of the rest of the 20th century in terms of museums. Alfred Barr, the founder of MoMA, is a regular visitor to the Newark Museum. And this idea that no article in this case costs more than 50 cents and you can find these down in the local department store, like at Bamberger's, is what the early design exhibitions at MoMA will be. Most of them are actually designed under $10. This is where I got the name of my talk from, the name of my book from, excuse me, Made in Newark. So this was an exhibition that Bamberger held, as I said up there, 1913, 1914, and 1915. And there were live demonstrations of people making goods in these shows. One of the great things is that the local Whitehead and Hogue company, which is the company that made these pins and actually invented the first spring pin like this. I've only seen an exhibition about that in the British Museum, never in America, celebrating Whitehead and Hogue. They actually were making these pins at the entrance, and then you could get them. Then you could also see peanut butter being made. You could see willow chairs being woven. You could see different kind of notions and textiles assembled. So the excitement of things being made in Newark and being sold in Newark is where I went with my book, and one way to think through the larger context of thinking through the book plates. Here's a lovely plate made by Bamberger's, which had a picture of the public library at the bottom right next to the department store. It's a lovely way you can think this isn't Newark made. There was very little, very little fancy Chinaware made in the U.S. at this time. The first American president, let's say, to order White House China is Woodrow Wilson. So there's not a lot of fancy ceramic companies, and decals like this are an English specialty, and so that's an import. And another way to connect the library and Dana to Bamberger's is to know that there was a library branch in the basement of the Bamberger store for employees, but also for the public. And one of the ways to understand Dana is also to notice there's vases, and the bookshelves are adorned with prints and art, applied arts, industrial arts, though. And there's not really a differentiation made between the Japanese woodcut, let's say, and the vase. And the way that the cultural institution was integrated into the city is remarkable. You can see here there's trade journal exhibitions. There were also library drop-off boxes at other department stores, and also at fire stations and at pharmacies and other places, police stations too. The first real big exhibitions that the Newark Museum conducts of industrial arts are the textile industries and the ceramics industries, big New Jersey businesses and firms, right? So Trenton was a hub for ceramics. Textiles was spread out, and people were demonstrating things like how to spin. And here you can see that people were demonstrating really ancient, fundamental processes, like using a spindle and distaff, or carding and kind of really ways you get yarn. basic yarn. And then on the right, one of the new kind of really high-end luxury industries that was just new in America was being demonstrated as well, right? Which was silk tapestries. So these demonstrations are where I'll situate the making and the importance and the emphasis on making. So here's the larger stained glass window dedicated to Hugo Fröhlich inside the museum. There's great ways in which this resonated with the city. I showed you sewing. Here's another way. Shop work resonated with Newark's industrial past. Right outside the library and museum is a statue to Seth Boyden, one of the great inventors of the city. I know that the founder of celluloid, Hannibal, what's his name? Inventor of flexible film is mentioned in, he was a Newark person. The celluloid is invented in Newark in the late 19th century and really gives rise to the film industry. He's mentioned in the film outside. Seth Boyden could also be up there as a very important figure for steam engines and locomotions and things, locomotives and things like that. So he also came up with a patent for malleable iron and patent leather. Newark's also big in shoe production. So there's a way in which the library and the museum are looking outward and connected with the city. Exhibitions of printed matter often were like this. And what's great is that teachers could check them out for use in their classroom. People could, borrow artworks, basically. Art students could take out pictures, not just books. And there were also exhibitions of these book plates as art. So here, Wilbur Macy Stone was a trustee. And this is one of the early exhibitions. Dana just got there a few years ago. And he's saying, and this is the breadth of John Cotton Dana, which is somewhat inexplicable considering he grows up in a rather remote area of Woodstock, but which I just kind of attribute to his zeal in some ways and his excitement and for culture. He says this includes the best American and foreign designers, and a unique collection by women artists. So to think through everyone being included in this show is quite interesting. Edwin French, or E.D. French, is one of the foremost book plate designers of that era. So objects like this were in the exhibition of Wilbur Macy Stone. You can see some of them are very Beaux-Arts on the left, and then on the right you can see Bixby, who's a big St. Louis donor, and if you go to the university out there, George Washington University, there's a lot named after Bixby. A little bit more of a caricature, let's say, and also I'd say a kind of lettering that Art Nouveau lettering from 1910 that might forecast what comes up in the 60s. Very influenced by the Viennese school. So there's a real range that French is able to make for public consumption on the left and then private consumption on the right. The Newark Museum really cannot be sorted out aesthetically. It is one of the reasons that I like to look at book plates again, because it levels the playing field, and instead of having kind of aesthetic debates, we talk about what's the book plate doing as an action. So sapientia, knowledge, wisdom, here being celebrated in one book plate. And I'm really just going to show you book plates now. This is the heart of my talk. And here you can see how Ronald Jenkinson was another trustee. The Jenkinson collection in the children's department, a subset of the children's room, had its own book plate to appreciate and to signal appreciation for Jenkinson. Who knows if Jenkinson was active in its design or whether it was a favorite book of Jenkinson's. That we don't know, but the range of book plates here is what I mean by appealing to many different constituencies, whether it's the patron or the client, the children coming in. So that range is amazing. And this is like having a button for every season, I would say, or a different bookmarker printed out each month. This is a way to kind of engender kind of excitement about the institution, whether it's this bold orange, which should be exciting to many of you here at Princeton, on the left, which is very much, I think, thinking in terms of the state and state history on the right. I don't know whether it's Robert Treat, the Puritan, coming to establish Newark in 1666, or whether it's Captain Carteret. That's not really clear. It's a vague kind of gesture to a romantic notion of history that people might have seen in a in a book illustrated by Howard Pyle or some other kind of story. There are many drawings like this. So this isn't actually a finished book plate. This is a sketch in the library. And that's also kind of interesting. I'll return to this point later. But apprentices, people training to be librarians and to be museum, he started the first museum apprentice program in this country. Those people all had to make book plates. It was part of their way of thinking through what materials were and learning how the printing press works. So these are interesting documents. Some of these might be by professional artists. I haven't tracked them all down, but you can see how this is being thought through. This is a sketch for a printing. We have noted German and Austrian designers who were active in Newark and designing advertising in Manhattan for department stores, like Carl Cadiz, who are signing their book plates for the Newark Public Library. So the organization of knowledge here is being celebrated. Newark has many different departments, and there are many even versions of the same ideal. The worth of a book is in its use. Again, this kind of very pragmatic approach to culture. John Ruskin is often long-winded and a little bit, I'd say, esoteric for some people in terms of celebrating history and age. But here, there's a wonderful way in which I think this is still current, that people want to get wisdom condensed for them in tiny pills and swallow them, and that is not to be done, says Ruskin. And so this wonderful quote from John Ruskin I think, gives you a sense of how Dana is reading widely and able to kind of to be a kind of prod always and a kind of punster and jokester. Here he's telling everyone in Newark that the lawyer, the physician, the preacher, the engineer, the manufacturer, the manager, the salesman, the fireman, the mason, you're all the same. You all need to read. He has a lovely creed for Americans that he publishes as a book plate on the left, which is it says it's progressive, and it's quite progressive. It says, if my country does wrong, I shall oppose it in that wrong. It is not what we consider I think, what did John McCain call it, half-baked nationalism this week. It's quite inclusive and quite also activist in terms of its idea about culture. And then on the other hand, he can turn around and he can be an antiquarian and quote Peacham's Complete Gentleman from 1634 and say that there is no book that is bad. I love John Cotton Dana's 12 famous rules about reading. You have them in your hand. Read some more, read anything, read about everything, read enjoyable things, read things you enjoy yourself, read and talk about it, read very carefully, some things, read on the run, most things. Don't think about reading, but just read. So this notion that people have to learn how to learn on the right, that printing is a kind of warehouse, storehouse, that you need to, quote, hold the eel of wisdom by the tail. There's ways in which he's a little bit, let's say, of a preacher, I would say, and also a little bit of a heckler, kind of saying that you need to use your library more and more and more. Even though he did have incredibly high distribution, he always was ambitious for more. He made his own book plates like this. This is from 1909. A lovely little elm tree. He and his brothers were active in something called the Elm Tree Press, so they ran a press. One of his brothers, Ned, stayed in Woodstock and ran a press, while his brother, Charles Loomis Dana, who was a very noted physician, testified at some major scandalous trials in the early 20th century. The Danas who were down in the metropolis wrote books, and the brother up in Woodstock printed them. So here is a book plate they made, and perhaps J.C. Dean himself made, for the Woodstock Inn, which still exists today. You can go visit up in Woodstock. One of my favorite John Cotton Dana plates, cut in the Japanese style, it says. It's not a self-portrait as a samurai, but it's exciting and it's bold in terms of colors. And it shows you, again, his aesthetic breadth. He had a co-worker named Beatrice Windsor, so he turned her name into a little rebus. She was a real busybody. She used to leave notes, which we have, saying, in the lunchroom, do not toast bread that's already been buttered. You will ruin the toaster and make it smell bad, and we don't want the whole library smelling of toasted butter. She was quite an active woman, and she was rather remarkable. Charles Buckles Falls' famous poster celebrating the gathering of books and this kind of patriotic efforts to send books overseas in World War I is here shrunk down and turned into a book plate. And on the left is a little small tear out. We don't know if that was a book plate or just something put out on the library desk that was encouraging Newark citizens to donate, right? That the war is not over. 1 million men are overseas and they are in need of books, right? If you've read your Christmas books, now send them to the public library. So there's the original on the left, original poster, and so you can see, I'm not sure if this is breaking intellectual property and whether you can worry about that, but I can think it's a way in which Dana was very aware of the power of images and the power of sentimental images. If he had his library apprentices and museum apprentices make their own book plates, this is a lovely book plate, which is, as it says, it's a reduced copy of a poster that is made for the library's own traveling exhibition of war posters. And what is fascinating here is that a man on the Newark Library staff, Bertold Audsley, actually designed this. And that if the poster doesn't have this explanation, and it didn't when I first found the poster, when I found this, I was really happy because it actually explains that Bertold Audsley was looking at a Hiroshige print in 1917, and you can match up what he's looking at and how he's turning this influence into and able to kind of modernize it in his own way, for his own time, for his own purpose. So print is wonderful in this way. It is the most portable of all our art forms and lightweight, and it does travel with this incredible speed. So when you think of John Cotton Dana, we have much more written about John Cotton Dana than his library assistants. But you have to think of the assistants, and you have to think of the whole engine of culture. The book plate on the right is unattributed. We don't know who made that, but there's a chance that he made it. There's a chance that someone on staff made it. They are big, yeah. And I think there's lastly, a way we can think of the book plate as a participatory window. So if it is this device that allows you to speak to children or speak to the businessman, Newark was very early in terms of having a science and business library and having those be separate branches even. Here, the book plate that's kind of blank suggests that you, the basic citizen, can be active in donating to your library, and your generosity can endure here and is worth memorializing and commemorating in this book plate. So I'd be remiss if I did not mention the special collections at the Newark Public Library. I hope most of you have been to the Newark Museum, and I imagine most of you have. There's great exhibitions happening there all the time. Down the street is the Newark Public Library, which has plates from the Nuremberg Chronicle donated by Louis Bamberger, remarkable objects in its collection. So here you can think that you could have your name on this, and you could donate to the special collections. It is where I really did most of my research, working with a man named Bill Dane, who worked there before World War II, and then he worked there after World War II up until 10 years ago or so. So long tenure and a remarkable institution that has weathered a lot with the city, but which is astonishing in terms of what it has as graphic art. So it's got a shopping bag collection that Bill Dane started, which I think is very much in the spirit of John Cotton Dana, thinking through shopping as a kind of aesthetic activity. So we don't have to end with such an ugly slide. We can go back to this. I'm not making an appeal for them financially, but it is remarkable how rich this institution was and how enriched it was by its citizens. I'm happy to answer any questions now.
So I enjoyed the presentation immensely. Could you give a little history of book plates before this period of time? In other words, when did they first start appearing? What was the purpose of them, and bring us up to this point?
So I'm not going to go that far back, but there is a lovely exhibition that's up right now called the Philosophy Chamber up at Harvard, which has in it books that were sent over to Harvard in the 18th century, and how the book plates in those books were intended to direct Harvard students to kind of be patriotic towards England. So book plates have long kind of instrumental lives. It goes back a few centuries. I can't say exactly when today. I know that you're interested in appraising and how far they go back, but I would wager they go back quite early. Keep in mind that the binding itself usually was applied at that point. So there were messages in the binding, and the owner kind of put their own stamp on books, literally, by binding books the way they wanted for their library, because he used to buy books unbound. And when the books were bound, often I've seen book plates from at least 1700, I think, or so they probably were. And I'm thinking, I would also look online in the British Library, I bet, because I think the King's Library, which is it's a wonderful site if you've ever seen it, the King's Library, which is preserved there, I bet they had book plates for the king.
What about the value of a book with a book plate? Does it make a big difference?
Again, I'm not an appraiser.
No,
I'm an art historian.
I'm just curious. I always used to put book plates in my books, but then I was discouraged to do that for future value.
But you're an important person.
I'm not.
No, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, in terms of, I usually don't change old books.
No.
I usually don't write in books either.
No.
So, I don't know, yeah. But I bought books only to have the book plate of the person who
The
owned it.
person who owned it.
So a famous art historian
Right.
or an artist. I once acquired a book by William Zorak, and that was kind of great to see William and Marguerite Zorak's own book plate that they made on
Well, it's interesting too, if you get a book with an old book plate in it, to research the history of the person.
Sure.
What was the heyday of the Bookplate?
I mean, I would say this is pretty
Okay.
important in America. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There still is an American Book Plate Association. It's chugging along, I imagine. There's collectors of everything these days. But I think in terms of production and kind of artists making their own book plates, and I'd say between 1880 and 1940
Okay.
is probably the peak moment of production. And I mean, J.P. Morgan has his own book plate. It's an upper class thing to do. It's not, it's interesting to me that he makes it a kind of civic ritual now for these librarians to engage in. And also seeing it as something that should change and should be swapped out like the flowers in your pot. Let's freshen up the library with a new book plate.
So did he put book plates in every book in the Newark Public Library?
I imagine they were, I mean, back then they didn't have magnetic strips.
Right.
So that was how they stamped them,
Yeah, it was there.
and then they put the book plate in actually as an ownership of, to signal that it's the public institutions and not, a privately owned book.
I just wanted to point something out that there's a case in the gallery right here, and it's got Dow prints, and we're talking about how people would borrow prints to teach and learn about
Yeah.
them. He's actually got instructions on how to draw these different prints and what to use for them.
Yeah.
So they've got a whole list of instructions out there.
Yeah, the Dow book out there on composition is one of I would say, the most important 20th century art book, art lecture book made in the period in 20th century. It goes through many different versions, editions, up until like from 1898 when it comes out, up into the 40s and 50s. He has many famous students. Some of them are mentioned out there. If you go to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, you can see Georgia O'Keeffe's work that she did working with Arthur Wesley Dow. And you can see her style, which is very much like his in terms of really flattening things out and having bold, large, blocky forms of color and getting away from shading. And it really does relate to Japanese printing. Out there, his prints are woodblock prints. He sets up the Ipswich Summer School as well as teaching at Columbia Teachers College. He's friends with John Dewey, who believes making is knowing, and that handicraft is important. So Dow is teaching batik as well as bookplate design, taking lots of ideas from the East in terms of cultural appropriation, woodblocks, batiks, but really kind of synthesizing them. And in the cover of his book, Composition, not competition, actually says, it spells out in Greek letters, synthesis. This notion of American cultures, or American culture being a synthesis of many cultures. And that America should take these ideas from Japan and take these ideas and put them together in a new kind of medley of sorts. So the Dow prints are wonderful. They're also small. You get the sense in that the woodblock, could roll right into the book plate easily. Good questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I do just want to say that we have copies of Made in Newark if anyone would like to purchase, and Shales, will you be kind enough to sign?
I'd love to sign them. I can't tell you whether to make them appreciate or depreciate me, but I'd be happy to sign them.
Thank you again, and we have them back here.
Okay.
But thanks for coming in. I have my email up there. If you have any questions, you can track me down and ask Art.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.